Welcome to our session number 11 on prayer and the prayer book. Happy to have you here. Usual opening slides acknowledging my support by the Jewish Federation of Ventura County and the fact that there's a lot of material on my website under these classes, then Jewish literacy class, and there are both copies of the slides. Tonight with the prayer book, there's this a sheet called the Jewish Guide to Blessings. So you will find that there, and recordings of classes. Okay, so Jewish prayer. There's actually a lot of forms of Jewish prayer. I was just discussing this the other night, that there are prayers of praise, of thanksgiving, of asking for stuff. So the Jewish prayer falls into a number of instances and categories. And importantly, there are three main categories. The first one is blessings. And you can usually tell blessings because they begin with the words Baruch atah Adonai. I'm going to say a lot more about that in a few minutes. Then there is liturgy. Liturgy is a fixed service. So it's prayers someone else has written, and it's typically in a prayer book. So here is the current Reform Movement's prayer book called Mishkan Tafila. I'm going to say a lot more about Mishkan Tafila. And then there's individual prayer, prayers between you and God. And all of those are kosher traditional forms of Jewish prayer. So we'll begin first with blessings. In Hebrew, they are called Barachot because they open with the word Baruch, which means blessed. That's in a verb form. In a noun form, it would be bracha. So a blessing is a bracha in sort of Ashkenazi Yiddish language. Or pronunciation, you may hear the expression of bracha. And the plural is barachot. So actually, the first entry in that big yellow book that I suggested that many of you buy will say various barachot. So at least now you know what they're talking about. It's various blessings. So every bracha opens with the words Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech olam, which we'll see this in a worksheet. It basically means blessed are you, Adonai, our God. Melech is literally king, often translated as ruler, ha'olam. So there's lots of issues in translation. Recently, there is a distinct trend to try and translate the Hebrew, which is inherently gendered, into something that is not gendered, because God is neither male nor female. So the word is melech, which means king. Malcha would be queen. You got to pick one. So if we're trying to be gender neutral, and we'll see this, in lots of different examples, the gender neutral English would be ruler or sovereign or something like that. And then after you've given that opening, and I sometimes describe that as God's area code. If you dial 1-805, those of us out in this neck of the woods would know that's Ventura County. And it's telling the phone system to start routing calls toward Ventura County. And then, there are the next three letters, if it's 388, that's Camarillo, and so on. 497 would be Thousand Oaks. So Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech olam is God's area code. You can think about it, if you want to think about it in these kind of anthropomorphic terms. A Jew says, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech olam, and the switchboard connects, and God says to whoever God happens to be speaking to at the moment, excuse me, I'm sorry, I have to take this call. And presumably God is multitasking and can take lots of calls at once. Then barachas go in one of two directions. One is what I sometimes call a thanks for the good stuff direction or blessing, which is a blessing over food, a blessing over seeing something unusual, something beautiful, something ugly. well, we may not see all of them, but I'll be happy to comment on them. That's one direction. If it's a mitzvah, if you're about to perform a mitzvah, we add the words Asher Kidshanu b'mitzvotav vitzivanu. So Asher Kidshanu means who makes us holy with his mitzvot. That's the mitzvotav. If it was her mitzvot, it would be probably mitzvoteha. Vitzivanu, and commands us. And then you have a phrase identifying the mitzvah. So if we said lahadlik ner shel Shabbat, it would be commanding us to light the lights of Shabbat. The blessing that we open with this, our study sessions are la'asok b'divrei Torah. And you'll see that in our little worksheet here, which means to occupy yourselves with words of Torah. The form of the blessing was minted by the rabbis, and they actually use that phrase in describing what they're doing, of minting. And the image is absolutely the one of stamping out coins. And so this is yet another example of a rabbinic mindset, which, I know some of you are psychological professionals, you might well describe as obsessive compulsive, which is to say the rabbis want us to say blessings, and we have to know if we've done it right. So let's just say we're eating some bread. Is it okay to say, thanks for the bagels, God? Is it okay? I can't remember where I first heard this, rub-a-dub-dub, thanks for the grub. Is it okay to say, boy, I wish, I had an everything bagel? The rabbis will say no. The rabbis are going to say, to discharge your duty of saying blessings, you have to say a blessing before eating. And if you're eating bread or having a meal with bread, you have done your job by saying, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hamotzi lechem min haaretz. That's the stamped, minted blessing. And then there's actually a phrase in Hebrew, you probably have never heard this one, called then you're yotze. You have discharged your duty. Bryce.
So it occurs to me that it's possible that the mindset was, okay, we've been cut off from sacrifice. Okay, we cannot do this in a way that is in accordance with the Torah. So we have to invent a way to keep the flow going toward God. And so we will mint these things, and everybody does this. Everybody says this every time you do this. It's an obligation. It isn't anything to do with worship. It is simply, or maybe worship secondarily, but it's simply an obligation to perform these duties. You can say them as fast as you want. Doesn't matter. They just got to go.
Yeah, so I think it's actually a brilliant insight, and I thank you for it because it never occurred to me. But in temple times, the way you would sacrifice animals was very carefully controlled. Which animal, for which occasion, how you did the slaughtering, who would do what. You could only have a priest. The priest had to be in a state of ritual purity. It could only be in the one place in the universe where you could do this. And so I often think about it, the priesthood and the temple worship service, as being like an antenna from earth to heaven. And if you monkey with the electronics in your radio, it's probably not going to work. You got to do it right. So that what you say actually makes perfect sense to me, that to maintain that relationship with God, because our main antenna is gone now. And so how do we maintain our relationship with God? The rabbis are going to be very precise on how to do it, in a way, just as the priests were very precise on how to fulfill the Torah. And even though the rabbis and the priests are usually considered to be sort of at opposite ends of the spectrum, I think in this case, that's absolutely true. The question of can you say blessings in different languages arises in the Talmud, and the answer is yes, but Hebrew is preferred. And now we're going to take a quick look at the Learner's Guide to Blessing. If you do have a question, raise your hand either electronically or, about half of you are live, and I can keep my eye on you. And so if you wave at me. So anyway, this sheet, the Learner's Guide to Blessings, is on my website. You can download it. And it covers some of what we've already covered. The opening, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. There's the Hebrew. There's the English. I often comment, God, the word Adonai is, we say when we come to God's actual name in the text, the word Adonai means my Lord. And we say that because we never, even in prayer, say God's actual name. And very traditional Jews won't even say Adonai unless they're praying. They will say Hashem. Marlene.
Well, I was just going to say, a lot of the times they use Hashem instead of Adonai, but you beat me to it.
Yeah, but they use it in a very precise way. If they're praying, they will always use Adonai. So the point is, we say Adonai because we're not going to say God's actual name. It's too holy. And even the word Adonai is considered holy. So a very traditional Jew would say Adonai only when praying. And in fact, sometimes when they are teaching kids, the prayer, let's say the Motzi, Baruch atah, they would say Adoshem, because if they're just teaching a prayer rather than actually saying a prayer, they still don't want to say Adonai. So the word Hashem is a generic, I would say, traditional word for God. And Hashem means the name, and this is God's name. So important point. And so actually for this name, I've put in here Yahweh, which is probably the way it's pronounced, although no one really knows. Adonai can mean my Lord. There's the word Adonai or Hashem. And now, as I mentioned, if it's a mitzvah, after the opening, we have Asher Kitshanu b'mitzvotav, who has made us holy with his commandments and commands us to. And now we will always in a mitzvah blessing have the infinitive form of the verb, if you're interested in those grammatical niceties. But back to the thanks for the good stuff. If you're eating bread, the blessing is Hamotzi lechem min haaretz, which literally means the one who brings forth bread from the earth. All kinds of interesting theology and discussion can be had about that, of course, because bread doesn't grow out of the earth, takes people to make grain and so on. But that's the blessing that the rabbis have minted and command us to say. If it's another kind of food, each food category has its own blessing. So wine gets its own blessing. After the usual opening, it's Borei Pri Hagafen, creator of the fruit of the vine. Those are the two most people know. Many people don't know. So anyway, if it's a fruit that grows on tree or something that grows on trees, we would say Borei Pri Ha'etz, the creator of the fruit of the tree. If it's something that grows in the ground or actually on a bush, like potato grows in the ground, berries grow in a bush, we would say Borei Pri Ha'adamah. And then there's another one if it's made from a grain, but it's not bread, and I don't actually remember the distinction. If it's a cookie, it gets a different blessing. And then there's a catch-all, and I'll just use the example of water, and this is number 5. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol nihiyeh bidvoro, whose word caused everything into being. Just a few other rules about blessing. If you have bread with a meal, you don't have to say blessings for anything else in the meal other than wine. Wine always gets its own blessing. But if you're having, let's say, a big meal and no wine, you just say the motzi, and that covers, the potatoes and the fruit and everything else. If you don't have bread, then you would say blessings for each food category. And there's all kinds of complicated rules. Suppose you have fruit salad. Which one do you say? Do you say them both? Applesauce. You're probably wondering, what do you say for applesauce? The answer is not Borei Pri Ha'etz, because it doesn't look like an apple. It's sauce. So you'd use number 5 there, Borei. I'm sorry, Shahakol Nihiyad Bidvoro. And the last thing I want to say, which will either amuse you, delight you, or annoy you, is the blessing for a banana is not ha'etz, it's ha'adamah, because bananas don't grow on trees. You may think bananas grow on banana trees, but according to the rabbis, what's the definition of a tree? It's something that has branches, and a banana tree doesn't have branches. So the blessing for a banana is Borei Pri Ha'adamah. Impress your Chabad friends when you're out to lunch. Yes, the bushes.
Rabbi, quick question, and I think you were kind of covering this, but maybe if you can just put a fine point on this. The last prayer, Shehakol Nihiyeh Bidvaro, is that really, as you were saying, is that really a catch-all, or in other words, that I could use this prayer even though there might be a more specific prayer?
No, I'm glad you asked. So if it's an apple, you can't use that one. This is for everything else, but not everything. So it's foods other. So water, steak, chocolate, mush, I don't know. Probably, I am not an expert on this, but that's the intent there. Okay, good, very good question. It's not only about eating. There's also a prayer for natural phenomenon. You see a natural phenomenon, I would think of something of beauty in your environment. And this is the blessing I'm actually going to ask you to repeat and learn, because this, I will explain in a moment how this blessing rewired my brain. So for natural phenomenon, I think I'll go along with the, I'll read it with the transliteration. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, oseh ma'aseh bereshit, which means who performs the work of creation. So just repeat after me. Oseh ma'aseh bereshit. Since I have you all muted, I can't hear you, but I assume you got that. So I'll tell you a story about my own, experience with this. I attended a class taught by Rabbi Richard Levy, who some of you may know. And he gave a talk just like this about blessings. And I'm sitting there. I have almost no Hebrew capability. This was long before I ever thought about going to rabbinical school. And I said, here's a long list of blessings in Hebrew. I'm never going to learn these, but I want to take on a new blessing as a spiritual discipline. So I took on this one, Oseh Ma'aseh Bereshit. And I reasoned everything is a work of nature. So although it's, supposed to be like you see a beautiful field, or, you're out in the woods or in the mountains and so on, I see one of my grandkids, well, I didn't have grandchildren in those days, my child's a work of nature. So I just use this as a general all-purpose blessing. And I took on the discipline. I would say halachically, you should say it out loud. You can say it quietly, but you should say it out loud. And then what I found is at the end of the day, you're kind of putting your head on the pillow and thinking about what happened today. And what I realized is blessings are the secret of happiness, because blessings force you to stop and realize that you've been given a gift. And whereas normal part of the day you go through, you've got problems, you've got this, you've got that. At the end of the day, you're exhausted. But if you've said, Oseh Ma'aseh Bereshit, and a few motzis and so on, at the end of the day, it just might occur to you, you've had a lot of blessings during the day. And that rewired my brain. So I encourage you to take this on. If the Hebrew is too big a barrier, do it in English. In the same talk that Rabbi Levy gave, and I said it at every wedding, I say it at every wedding, a gift without acknowledgement is a theft in some sense. And the acknowledgement are these blessings. Bryce.
A couple things. One, and I'm wondering if Cheryl will weigh in on this. The first one is that I think it does rewire your brain because you are now practicing mindfulness. You are, instead of having your inner dialogue and going on with your day and just moving from place to place and living abstractly, you're focusing on the world around you and being aware while you're being aware of it. But the other thing I wanted to mention is that it's about rote prayer. And I'm wondering, how does rote prayer, what is the ultimate purpose? Not just to, to thank God and whatnot. I know that there's something beyond that. And what is the purpose? Is it propitiation? Please don't hurt us anymore. What are the possible thought processes behind this?
So I'm going to ask Cheryl. I don't know if Cheryl, if you want to weigh in on that, other than to nod in agreement.
No, I nod in agreement with Bryce, because that's the basis of a lot of psychotherapy, or even in cognitive retraining after stroke. You're setting new pathways by rehearsing these things, and it's a learned behavior.
Yeah, and it's funny. I don't think of it in terms of mindfulness. I think of it in terms of gratitude. That adopting a mindset of gratitude, just at least it makes me feel like I've been gifted.
Well, it's much the same. It can be both things at the same time.
Sure. So in prayer obviously evolves out of either don't hurt me or, make the rains come in their time. And so sacrifice, people ask, why did Judaism adopt a system of sacrifice? And one of the answers that makes most sense to me is that was the way everybody prayed. If Jews just came out right off the bat and said, we're not going to have animal sacrifice anymore, it would be a radical departure and people wouldn't consider it prayer. Interestingly, the Romans considered Jews atheists. I think the Romans, maybe the Greeks, considered Jews atheists because God was invisible. There's no statues of gods. You must not believe in a God. So the idea of an invisible God was radical enough. So what some of the sages say about initiating or adopting sacrificial service was that God knew that someday the temple would be destroyed and we would have to come up with something else. But as sort of a bridge between pagan prayer systems and the prayers that God really had in mind, we built in this animal sacrifice. The point of prayer, another thing I often say when teaching about prayer, is one of the words in Hebrew for prayer is lehitpalel, which is a reflexive verb, meaning it's something you do to yourself. And it means literally to judge yourself. So I would say my own take on this is not that God needs our prayers, but we need to remind ourselves that it's not all about us, that there's other standards in the world, that there are other sources in the world that we need to turn to. And again, I would say, in a modern sense, in my own take on this, we turn to for sources of ethics and teachings in terms of, what's right and what's wrong. So I would say that is the purpose of prayer. And it's rote. And there are things you do that are rote. I tell my wife that I love her a lot. And, you would think that she would already know that, and I wouldn't have to tell her that. One might reason that way. One would reason that way right into a divorce, in my opinion. So in a relationship, you keep repeating even the good stuff. So that's the Osema Asevre sheet. By the way, I think I've done this before, and I'll do it again. There is a prayer. It's a thanks for the good stuff prayer that you say after going to the bathroom. And again, I always say, acknowledge that I am now showing off that, and also showing you that I use this prayer. It's Baruch atah Adonai asher yatzar et ha'adam b'chokhmah u'vara. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher yatzar et ha'adam b'chokhmah u'vara vo nekavim chalulim galui v'yadua lifnei kisei kivodecha she'im epatech echad mehem o yisatem echad mehem i'efshar lehitkayim v'la'amod lefanecha Baruch atah Adonai rofei chol basar u'mafli la'asot. The literal translation of that, which often doesn't appear in the prayer books, is blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of everything, who has fashioned humans wondrously with various openings and closings. It is known and revealed before you that if something should be wrongly kept open or stopped up, it would be impossible to stand before you. Bless you, Adonai, who heals flesh wondrously. And, my usual statement on this is if you've ever had problems with the plumbing, and by this, I don't mean your cast iron or porcelain plumbing, I mean what is called in Yiddish, your kishkes, which is your internal plumbing. If it's ever open too much or doesn't open at all, you're not doing so well. And then, God willing, a time comes when you're okay and you really know how to spell relief. Because things now have been restored. And I would say it's true of any illness. If you've had a serious illness and now you're okay, you feel insane gratitude for feeling okay. So what this is doing, very much along the lines that we were talking about before, is every time you go to the bathroom, we say this long prayer after you go to the bathroom for reasons which should be obvious now. But after you go to the bathroom, reflect on the fact that it worked. If we had a doctor here, but I think many of you know how many things have to go right for you simply to eliminate waste, to take, that food that you ate a few hours ago and water that you drank a few hours ago and have it digested successfully, nutrients withdrawn, things filtered, nerve endings have to open and close, your body has to keep moving the stuff along. It's astounding. It worked. It worked. You should feel insanely grateful every time you use the bathroom. And so that's what Judaism does. It tries to get you into that system by requiring you to acknowledge that it worked. Another very common prayer that is said on happy occasions that occur periodically. That's the technical definition: a special new event, new clothes, furniture, seeing a friend after a lapse of 30 days, a holiday, and so on. Usual opening: Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shehachianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh, who has sustained us, who's kept us alive and sustained us and enabled us to reach this season. Very common. It's a prayer we say on the first night of Hanukkah. It's a prayer we say on certain holidays, and so on. I think I have a few more. So that was the thanks for the good stuff group. The blessings. So if you're doing a mitzvah, you're lighting candles. Okay, that's nice. You might just light candles. If it's Friday night and you're lighting the candles for the sake of complying with the mitzvah of lighting Shabbat candles, you've got to let God, yourself, and the universe know. And I used to, say that this is so you get your frequent mitzvah miles. You take a flight on an airline. If you don't give them your frequent flyer number in the days before it was stored in the computer, you wouldn't get credit. So you have to acknowledge that you are doing this for the sake of the mitzvah. So as I mentioned before, we add, I'll try and go through it in the transliteration, Asher tidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel Shabbat, who has made us holy with his commandments. I'm translating literally here, and commands us to light the lights of Sabbath. Or if it's Hanukkah, lahadlik ner shel Hanukkah. Or if it's studying Torah as we open, it's la'asok b'divrei Torah. If you're putting on a talit, it's lahitatef batzitzit. And there's, lots of commandments. Oh, there's the one for the talit. Can't read. Okay, so that's the only one I have. So any questions on the minted blessings? Okay, if one occurs to you, you can ask. So now I want to talk a little bit about liturgy and services. And actually, after I finish the PowerPoint,
that's fine.
I'm going to go. Yes, go ahead.
I apologize really quickly.
Problem.
You just look back just for another five more seconds on the last one. Yeah. And which one was the talit? I'm sorry. It was just
it's number 10.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
It's lehita teif batzitzit, which literally means to wrap yourselves in tzitzit. That's the literal definition, to enwrap ourselves with the fringes. So that's a blessing. So you're putting on tefillin, there's a different blessing. You're hanging up a mezuzah. I'm doing a baby naming, I think on Sunday, and they've asked me, in addition to help with them, to put a mezuzah on the baby's room. And so likboa mezuzah, which means to affix the mezuzah. So it's a general mitzvah blessing. Okay, so I want to move on to liturgy and services. So for liturgy and services, we have a prayer book. The Hebrew word for prayer book is sidur, and sidur means arranged in order. We have a Passover program that we call the Seder, because it's in a particular order. Mm-hmm. In Israel, in conversational Hebrew, if you ask someone, how are you? Or how are things? A very common reply would be beseder. Means in order. It means I'm fine. I'm okay. And as you will see, there is a very particular order to the worship service, and actually that order is sustained through different, through weekday prayers, morning, afternoon, evening prayers, holiday prayers. Always basically the same order with slightly different changes for different holidays, different times of the day. The prayers in the liturgy are as old as Torah. The Shema and the V'ahavta, if you know what I'm talking about, come right out of the Torah. Many of them come out of the Talmud. The phrase Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam does not appear in the Bible. So any phrase with that, any prayer with that phrase in it, is post-biblical. And generally, all of this stuff is going to be in the Talmud. So all of those blessings are Talmudic. There are prayers that we sing on Friday night, Lecha Dodi, which is from the 1500s in the town of Sfat. It's a kind of a Kabbalistic or mystical poem. And then in our prayer books, and even in an Orthodox prayer book, there are prayers for the state of Israel. So if you have a prayer for the state of Israel, by definition, it's no earlier than 1948, because there was not a state of Israel. So very important thing to keep in mind is the Torah doesn't change, the Bible doesn't change, the Talmud doesn't change. Yes, we write commentaries, but the prayer book is always changing, even in the Orthodox world. Typically in the Orthodox world, they will tend to add prayers and pretty much never take anything away, which makes the service longer and longer. And if you don't have more and more time, you just go faster and faster. But even in the Orthodox world, prayers get changed. And certainly in the conservative and the Reform world, prayers get changed, both like when you have a new Reform prayer book, you're going to reflect Reform theology, so prayers will get changed. And as the theology evolves, or as thinking evolves, we will change the prayer book to reflect the thinking, going back and forth. And I can give you examples of that. Bryce.
Yeah, so the one question that I have and the one little observation first is that what's remarkable is that Judaism over the centuries, because of catastrophes and whatnot, have had to reinvent itself. And even as old as it feels, it's still a reinvented religion, and an original adherent to it might hardly recognize it.
Yeah,
and,
I absolutely agree with you. Sorry.
And the question is Tafilah related to tefillin?
Yes, they are.
I know
words for prayer.
Both
Yeah,
prayer. Okay.
So tefillin are, I mean, they're called phylacteries, but I've never met anyone who knows what the word phylactery means other than tefillin. Phylacteries actually come from the root of the same root as prophylactic, which means something that wards off something. Prophylactics, take medications. Prophylactically, you're taking them to prevent disease. Presumably, the idea of calling tefillin, now I'm getting confused, phylactery, sorry, is because they ward off bad things. And there's arguments, back in the 1500s and 1600s about what order the prayer should be in the tefillin. But yeah, it's always reinventing itself. I would say all religions evolve and change. You hear, and talking about Judaism in particular, I remember, before I studied this seriously as an adult, you just sort of have this suspicion that, well, the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox are practicing the same religion as maybe Moses and Abraham and so on back in ancient times. And, nothing could be further from the truth. And in the same way, Christianity evolved from a early church to, now we have Presbyterians and Episcopals and Methodists and all kinds of different branches of Christianity. And all religions evolve. And my main point here is the prayer book is the vehicle for that evolution. One of the interesting things that struck me when I learned about Muslim prayer is at a Muslim worship service, everything that's said is out of the Quran. So different verses and so on, but it's all Quran. And that certainly is not true either, I would say, in Jewish prayer or Christian prayer. So this is sort of what I was talking about. This is where the theology hits the road. So for example, in one of our prayer about God's strength, it's called the Gevurot. In the traditional version of the prayer, the end of the prayer, which summarizes the prayer for traditional Jews and in the conservative movement, is Baruch atah Adonai mechayei hametim. Blessed are you, Adonai, who gives life to the dead. So if you're talking about God's strength, what's the most incredible thing that God can do? That is revive the dead. In the Reform movement, they got away from that literal interpretation about the dead being physically revived in the Messianic age. So they switched to Baruch atah Adonai mechayei hakol. And that's still used, I would say, in Reform synagogues. And now in this latest prayer book, in parentheses, you have the old version. So you can use whichever one you want. And I heard, Reform rabbis saying that it's a way of interpreting mechayei hametim. One gives life to the dead in spirit. Yes.
Rabbi, exactly on that point, giving, I guess, recognition to the spirit. I'm familiar, I think, with Judaism having celebrated reincarnation, and I think you may have talked about that previously, that we have that type of concept. Is that where that, I guess, that idea comes from? What you're kind of saying with these.
You mean reincarnation or resurrection?
I apologize. I'm sorry. I might have misspoke then.
Yeah, the answer is both. That a traditional belief, the rabbis of the time asserted the idea of resurrection, of physical resurrection of the dead in the day of the coming of the Messiah. The mystics believe or teach reincarnation, which means your soul goes to a storehouse of souls and then is reborn into this world, into a different body. And the answer to which one is true is God knows. But I was discussing this actually with a Catholic scholar today, who tells me he meets many Jews who insist that Jews don't believe in an afterlife. And I said, well, that may be true. You know, when people ask me, what do Jews believe about the afterlife? My answer is, I don't know, go ask them. What is not true is that Judaism doesn't teach that there is an afterlife. I would say every movement up until recently would absolutely teach that there is an afterlife. And I would, you know, in some Jewish movements, certainly humanistic Judaism, which doesn't hold with the idea of God. And I would say probably many Reform rabbis would also say that Jewish teachings about the afterlife are not something they take seriously. But Judaism has always taught that there is something. There's no agreement on what it is, but that there is something. Lots of different prayer books. Each movement has its own prayer book. There are lots of changes in the prayer book. We know the prayer books date to at least the 8th century because in a geniza, a storehouse for old Jewish stuff in Cairo, Egypt, when this storehouse was discovered, it was literally walled up into the walls of a synagogue. And they found it in the early 1900s. And because Cairo is such a dry climate, a lot of the paper and parchment survived. So they found prayer books that are from the 7th and 8th century Common Era. And, you know, the Greek community had a prayer book, and different communities, the Egyptian community, different communities will have their own prayer books. It's certainly true today in broad terms, you know, Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform will have their own prayer book. But, you know, the North American Reform has a prayer book. If you go to Israel, the Israeli Reform synagogue will have a prayer book. And guess what? It's all Hebrew, surprisingly enough, except for the Aramaic stuff. And then you'll see a translation into Hebrew of the Aramaic. And in the Orthodox world, you have lots and lots of different Orthodox movements. You know, you have Hasidic, and you have one form of Hasidic, which is Chabad, and you have modern Orthodox, and you have Sephardic, and, you know, you'll have Moroccan prayer books and Greek prayer books and Turkish prayer books and so on. They will all be different. Each community will have its own prayer book. The basic prayers are the same, but you will find they're called piyutim, they're poems, which will be very specific to individual communities. The newest Reform prayer book is the one I showed you a moment ago, called Mishkan Tafilah, which I guess is the sanctuary of prayer. The Mishkan was the portable, I wonder if they translate Mishkan Tafilah. No, they don't translate it. The Mishkan was the portable sanctuary that was in the desert. And the service is a remnant of the sacrificial service. So I talk about this a lot as well. In temple times, we had 3 animal sacrifices a day. So therefore, you will see 3 prayer services a day and a particular prayer which takes the place of that animal sacrificial service. It's the Amidah. We'll talk about that in a little bit. In temple times, the priest said the prayers. Today, everyone says the prayers. And one of the ideas in going from Judaism being a religion of temple times to a religion of modern times is the idea that we have become a nation of priests, and each of our homes become miniature temples. So there's elements of this, the ritual washing of hands, the challah as a ritual bread, are remnants of the temple worship system. Okay, as I started mentioning, the structure of every service is basically the same. So we have different services for morning, afternoon, evening, weekdays, Shabbat, high holidays, and there will be differences within that structure for a particular occasion. So for example, a prayer that takes in a typical evening service, Shabbat or weekday, a prayer which is one line And during the daytime, that prayer may be, 5 minutes. On Yom Kippur, might be 2 hours because they've added so much liturgy to it. Melodies are different. If you've got a professionally trained cantor, there will be a different melody for different holidays, and it's not, and it'll extend throughout the prayer service. For certain prayers, and here are just some, and I know not all of you will be familiar with all of these prayers. The Barachu, which is the call to worship, the Kaddish, and a reading of Torah. A minyan is required of 10 adult Jews. The reason for that is these prayers call for a congregational response. So the call to worship begins, Barachu et Adonai hambarach, and the congregation responds, Baruch Adonai hambarach le'olam va'ed. Sorry? Yeah, thank you.
I was going to respond to you.
Right. And in the Kaddish, there's a couple of places where the congregation jumps in with a brichu. There's a few amens, and there's an entire Yehei Shmei Rabba Mavorach Le'olam L'Almei Maya. That's the job of the congregation to say that. So if a congregation has to do something, you can be sure that these obsessive compulsive rabbis are going to have a bit of a hissy fit, that's a technical Aramaic term, over how many Jews does it take to form a congregation. And they come up with the number 10. And there's 2 reasons for that. One is the spies that go and spy out the land and come back giving a negative report are called a kahal at some point, which is a name for a congregation, and there's 10 spies. And then also when Abraham
and the minion, when he fights with God.
Sorry?
Abraham, bargains with God.
Yes, when Abraham bargains with God of how many good people you need to find in a town to save an entire town that God is planning on destroying, they finally decide on 10. So that's where the rabbis come up with the number 10. And it's 10 people who are obligated to pray. So who is obligated to pray? In the traditional Jewish, pray 3 times a day at regular times. In the traditional Jewish world, it's adult men. By adult, we mean men over 13. This is a side point, but it's a very important side point. In traditional Judaism, women are exempt from all positive time-bound commandments. I feel like I say this so often, you've probably heard me say it before. So what's a positive time-bound commandment? Positive means it's a thou shalt, not a thou shalt not. Time-bound means it applies at certain times of the day. So a clear example would be the obligation to pray. We pray morning, afternoon, and evening. Women are exempted. If you ask a very traditional rabbi, your local Chabad rabbi, why are women exempted from that? The answer will be because women are already at a higher spiritual level than men and don't need the added discipline of praying 3 times a day. It will also be observed that if both men and women are obligated to be in a minyan praying these prayers 3 times a day, nobody's left watching the kids. So it certainly has a practical element as well. Negative commandments, don't eat pork, are obligatory on everyone. And even positive commandments, I would say, like eat matzah, would be obligated on both men and women. Now, since I'll just jump right to Reform, since in the Reform world, we treat men and women equally in terms of their obligation to pray, we would definitely count women in a minyan. And I would say that's true, certainly in the US Reform movement. In Canada, it's a mix. There are Canadian Reform congregations that still don't count women in the minyan. And in the conservative movement, it's mixed. Some would insist on counting women, not counting women. And then I would also say in the Reform movement, many Reform rabbis, including me, are flexible. If I'm holding services, in Ojai or another small community, and I don't get 10 people, in theory, some of those prayers that I just mentioned would be said quietly and not out loud, or not said at all. But my own approach would be not to worry about whether I have a minyan. If somebody's there to say Kaddish for a parent, we're going to say Kaddish. The key prayers, and we'll go through this in a little more detail. Kabbalah Shabbat, I mentioned when I talked about Kabbalah, I think last week, it means receiving. So Kabbalah Shabbat is welcoming or receiving the Sabbath. At some point in time, we actually have the Barachu, and that's the first time we need a minyan when we say the Barachu, because there's a response. So there's a whole long list of prayers, both on the Sabbath and even on weekday prayers, which are kind of warm-up prayers. You may have heard me say this as well. This is one of my favorite puns, but I take it literally. The warm-up is foreplay, that you don't jump into an intense relationship and an activity with God like prayer without warming up. So we warm up with these introductory prayers. And on the Sabbath, that may go for an hour or more, since nobody's in a rush to go to work. In a traditional service, you might have an hour's worth of warm-up prayers on Sabbath morning. We have the Shema and her blessings. That's probably the best known prayer. And then the Amidah or the Tafilah. So that means, the Amidah means standing. Tafilah means prayer. It's the central prayer of the worship service. I'm just going to finish this section and I'll call on you, Cheryl. This is what takes the place of animal sacrifice. It has 19 sections on weekdays, even though it's called the Shemona Esrei, meaning 18. That's a big clue that at some point somebody added one, and there's some speculation on which one was added after the prayer got its name, Shemona Esrei, or 18. And a lot of these 19 sections, we ask God for stuff. I've had conversations with some of you about this. But on the Shabbat, we pretend that we don't need anything, so we eliminate those sections from that prayer and talk about the holiness of Shabbat. We're going to talk a little bit about Shemona Esrei in a moment. Cheryl.
How did some of the physical rituals associated with prayer come about? So when I do the Shema, I cover my eyes.
Yes.
When it comes time for Kadosh, 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 I go up on my toes 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
At certain times, I take 3 steps forward. And I wonder, what is really the significance to me doing,
So there are explanations for all of...
when I sometimes go to Saturday services, there's a guy who sits next to me, and at certain times he grabs the seat in his hands.
Right. Okay. So these are broadly, thank you for asking. It's a very good question. Those kinds of things are broadly called kavanot. The word kavanah means intention. So it's a way of focusing your intention on a particular prayer. So for example, the Shema is such an intense moment proclaiming the oneness of God that you cover your eyes to blot everything else out. When that arose, I don't know. But just to show you, we can always go further. One of my teachers, Larry Kushner, who is something of a mystic, adds this to covering your eyes. He says, do this. Take your 3 middle fingers and put it on your forehead. It's a shin. Curl your thumb at a right angle and put it on one eye. That's a dalet. Your little finger, smallest finger is the smallest letter. That's a yod. So in doing this, you have the word Shaddai on your forehead. So that's a way of deepening the intention. And you will discover that you smudge your glasses when you do this. So just know that. The step, going up on your toes for Kadosh, 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 the phrase Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh is from the book of Isaiah, when the prophet has a vision of God's throne with seraphim, burning angelic creatures flying around the throne. And my understanding of that one is we're trying to get up there with the seraphim. That's why we go up on our toes on each kadosh. The 3 steps forward and backward at the beginning of the Amidah, we're approaching God's throne. So we take 3 steps forward. And then at the end of the Amidah, which is Osei Shalom B'Mramav, it's the end of the prayer for peace, we take 3 steps backward, and in front of God's throne, we bow in the different directions. So you also see, somebody asked me about this the other day, when people are praying, like at the Western Wall, you'll see them, it's sometimes called shuckling. You're praying, with moving, I suppose I would do it this way, you can see, moving your body. I think in one of the Psalms, it talks about praising God with every bone in your body or with all your body. So that's a way of fulfilling that element literally. So I would say, broadly speaking, anything you can do to make prayer more meaningful or focused or sacred, as long as it's not prohibited, for you, making prayer for someone, not for you, Cheryl, but for someone, making prayer more holy might be eating pepperoni while you pray. You can't go that far. But anything like covering your eyes, going up on your toes, having a beautiful talit, there's a concept called hidur mitzvah, beautifying the mitzvah. So buying a beautiful talit, I like, when I'm not leading services, I love to, for the Amidah, which during the daytime when I'm wearing a talit, I love to wrap myself in the talit, in the prayer shawl. And I feel like I'm in this little cocoon of prayer and shutting out the rest of the world. But there's a zillion things, and I think even in our prayer book, they will say something like, some follow the practice. I'm just looking for it, of going up on your toes. Gevurot. Where is it? Oh, this is evening. Anyway, I think our prayer book gives you some direction. The Art Scroll prayer book, which is a traditional Orthodox prayer book, also has a lot of instructions as to what to do. Okay, any other questions at this point? Okay, I'm going to continue.
Rabbi, just a quick sidebar on that, just to make sure, the kadosh, as what Cheryl was talking about, that's holy, and that's generally found in the kedusha.
Yes, the kedusha. The kedusha is the name of the prayers. Typically, are named for their first significant word. Not always, but like the Shema, first word is Shema. The kedusha means holiness because you're proclaiming God's holiness. And it's actually not the first word in that. Actually, the first word is Nekadesh et Olam. I can't remember it now. But the first word actually has to do with holiness. Nekadesh et Olam. Why can't I remember it? My brain isn't working that well.
And then it's Kakatu.
Yeah, Kakatuv. Kakatuv al yad niviyacha, which means as it was written by the hand of the.
And this is one where you do zeh.
Yeah. Okay, so you're getting in now deeper. So just before you go up on your toes, we sing Kakatuv al yad niviyacha, which means slow down. Okay. Kakatuv, as it was written, al yad niviyacha, by the hand of your prophet. They're talking about Hosea. V'amar ze el ze. I can do it when I say. I'm sorry.
El Zevi Amar.
Hang on. Let me just find it rather than keep trying to guess it. Shema V'Rotecha. I can do it if I do the whole thing, but if I try and just do bits and snatches of it, it's hard. And Nekadesh, so it says, V'kara, sorry. V'kara ze el ze ve'amar. V'kara, and they called, ze el ze, one to the other, ve'namar, and said, Kadosh, 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 Adonai tziva'ot, l'chol ha'aretz, kivod. And that's quoting from Isaiah, which actually underlines another important point, which is worth bringing out, that our prayer book is a literal cut and paste of things out of Torah, out of Talmud, out of prophets. So this is a little phrase from the prophets. And the rabbis have cut and stitched together sacred things that they insist on us saying. So that's also kind of a unique element. Another important element on days when we read Torah, traditionally that is on Shabbat. On certain holidays we read Torah, and on Mondays and Thursdays. What's up with Mondays and Thursdays? Well, in ancient times, Mondays and Thursdays were market days. So when people were in town to go to the market, that would be a good opportunity to have a service to read Torah. So in traditional synagogues, and I would say even in Reform synagogues, if we're going to have a Monday or a Thursday, or conservative synagogue, if we're going to have a service on a Monday or Thursday, we're reading Torah. When I get together for rabbinic conferences, on Mondays and Thursdays, we will read Torah. Marlene.
Following what Cheryl was saying about the different things that we do, going up on our toes, for the Shema also, when we say Kaddish, doing the 3 points, etc.
Right.
You know, all my life, I've had the opportunity to go to Orthodox or conservative. I belong to Reform now, but you don't see, even at the Orthodox, even around when I've been overseas, you don't see a whole lot of people doing those unless you were brought up with that. I think it's a tradition. It's not that I was Orthodox growing up, but over the years, I was just, taught to go up on the toes, to go the 3 points, to cover my face. Right. But you don't see that at the Reform, Conservative, Orthodox. You don't see that on a regular basis, especially with the younger generation. So you don't. I think it's a learned. I think.
Yeah. So the question that I don't know the answer to is it a custom or is it Jewish law? My impression is that it's more of a custom rather than a matter of Jewish law. And I know rabbis that specifically reject those things as being sort of ancient idiosyncratic oddities, which in our modern practice, we don't do anymore. And I know a same rabbi I'm thinking of has changed, in this case, her approach, and now does it. Just like I know rabbis that won't wear a yarmulke or a talit because it's a ritual thing. This would be in Reform world. I know Reform rabbis who will wear a talit, but not a yarmulke because the talit is clear in Jewish tradition why we wear it. Yarmulke is very unclear. Yeah.
Well, I don't think when I was taught to do this, as a tradition, I was never told that it was in writing you had to do it. It was something that we were told to do.
Yeah, I think it's more of it's called a minchag, which is a tradition, rather than a actual law.
Right. Okay.
Yep. Okay. Reading of the Torah, Aleinu at the end, Mourner's Kaddish at the end, and there are lots of differences between Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform services. So when I used to teach this in person, I would actually have you open your prayer books and point out some of these things. I'm going to go through, you know what? I think I'm going to fly through the actual prayer book. I have Mishkan Tafila on Kindle. Who doesn't? And at the very end, I can screen share that and show you some of these prayers. And it's a little more difficult to go back and forth between morning and afternoon and weekday and so on. But I'll try and point out some interesting things. Including the sections. I'll just point it out in the prayer book. Okay, so now we've gone through blessings, Barachot. We've gone through the prayer book, the liturgy, and we're going to talk about individual prayer. Cheryl.
Do you want to comment that in the Mishkan Tafilah prayer book that there are numbers that are written for the pages, and there's also numbers in the brackets because there are different versions?
Yes,
so you have to specify those numbers.
Yeah, I'll point that out. Thank you. Okay. So individual prayer, it can take many forms, talking to God and waiting for an answer. So again, this is something that was taught to me by one of my teachers who said, and I think I've mentioned this before, find a quiet place where you won't be interrupted. Put your head in your hands and talk quietly out loud to God. Do not worry about whether there is a God. This is not the time to worry about whether there is a God. This is the time to talk to God. I often use the image of the first time you are dancing with a person who just does it for you. The first time you're in the arms of someone who you know is fantastic, and you're hugging and dancing, and it's great. And now all of a sudden you start wondering, well, what really is this attraction? Is this kind of Darwinian evolution that is propagating species? Are there pheromones? Are there chemical compounds which result in the attraction? Is it, what he or she is wearing? I wonder what is actually doing this. After a while, you're sitting there thinking, and he and she has gone off to find somebody else. There is a time for analyzing biology and evolution, and there's a time just to hug and touch and love. There is a time for theology and wondering whether there is a God and what's the nature of God, and there's a time just to pray. So for me, I can tell you it has been life-changing just to talk to God and also to listen for an answer. And I often say, if there really is a God and God responds, that's pretty darn powerful. If there is no such thing as God, but you're speaking to God, you can't lie. It's utterly idiotic to think about lying to God. You will hear yourself aloud, quietly, but aloud, speaking the deepest truths of your heart. That's also pretty powerful. So I highly recommend that just individual prayer. It is a valid form of Jewish prayer is meditation, particularly in Kabbalah. Contemplation, they talk about standing and just studying a candle or other object, for significant lengths of time. Reciting particular parts of the Shema or other parts of the service. And so, generally there's more to Judaism than liturgy. Your individual prayer is traditional, important in your spiritual life. I often compare the liturgy to a Hallmark card. I remember, I talk about this a lot when I do a teaching minyan where I'm talking about the prayers. What could God get out of me praising God? Particularly when the words that I'm praising God with are written in this prayer book, which presumably God has something to do with. And, I'm reading what God told me to read. Do I really think God is getting something out of this? No, it's about me. It's about my prayer life. It's about taking time to connect with God. And so I think about the prayer book as like a Hallmark card. They're beautiful words, but they're someone else's words. And in our service, and also in our lives, there is time for individual conversation. And I often say, if you're sending a card to someone you care a lot about, you better write something more than "love you, Mike" at the bottom. You better write something significant. You can fight about that amongst yourselves afterwards. And you better send a card. I have to tell you, my wife, Sonia, really doesn't like cards, doesn't like wasting paper, doesn't like the expense. But boy, that was not true of my late wife. If she didn't get a card, she was upset. And if she was upset, nobody was happy. I will never forget, after our first child, from Mother's Day, I got her cards from the kids, but I didn't get her a card from me for Mother's Day. Reasoning silly me, she's not my mother. Okay, I throw myself on the mercy of the court. Didn't work, boy. I only made that mistake once. At least give me the credit of learning. So anyway, and as I say, it's not so much that God needs our prayer, but we need to be the kind of people that pray. So on individual prayer, set a time for prayer, morning and evening, Shema, very classic and place. I said this before, don't let your scientific, logical, left brain doubts about God, which are perfectly reasonable and okay, interfere with your prayer life and relationship. Prayer and spirituality can not only be learned by books. This is a wonderful quote. There was an intellectual youth who felt he could learn everything from books. He read about the stars and became an astronomer. He read about history and became a historian. He read about swimming and drowned. So there are certain things you actually have to do and not just read about. And as I say, don't just sit there, pray something. It doesn't matter where you are. It only matters what direction you're headed in. Do something, do more, be consistent. And in the words of Tiny Tim, God bless us, everyone. Just one or two, I think maybe one more slide for next week. All of Jewish history in 90 minutes. It's impossible to do. I have a little bit of history in my book. There's not much history in the handbook, but boy, is there a lot of information online. So here are some suggestions. And this last one, oh, I bet I can do this. Oh, I just want to show this to you. Let's see how much time. We have some time. Let's see. I'm clicking this and my guess is you're still watching the same thing, right? Somebody say something. Whoops, did I lose you all?
Yes. No. Next week, all of Jewish history in 90 minutes.
Yes. So let me just show you this thing because it's fantastic. Are you still seeing next week or are you seeing now?
No, the Jewish timeline.
Jewish timeline.
Oh, cool. Oh, that's interesting. I just brought it down to the other screen. So here is a Jewish timeline. And actually, it's not easy for me to zoom in on this screen. I could do it easily on the other screen. But the fun thing about this is I think you can get kind of a sense of what you're looking at. There's a lot of things. So for example, I'll put my cursor over the destruction of the temple. So this pops up. You can see a little information, and then you can click here or here and go to articles from Wikipedia or the Jewish Encyclopedia about that particular topic. And now somebody else is trying to ask me to do something. So anyway, it's just a very cool website. Let me see if I close that, what happens. I think we're back to next week. And let me get back to y'all. Okay, so I'm going to end the slideshow. Oh, maybe, yeah, whoops, I'm going to stop share. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is go here. Go here. What I'd like to do is show you a little bit about now what we're looking at. I presume you see candle blessing and okay, good. So this is the Kindle version of this prayer book. And I want to point out a few general things. So this is, we're actually, thank you, Cheryl. We're on page, whoops. Oh boy, this is the only problem with this is it really jumps around. Okay, so if you look down here, you see a 2 and page 120. There are two versions of this prayer book. A relatively thin one, in which this prayer is page number 2, and a much thicker one, which has weekday prayers in addition to Shabbat prayers, in which this page is 120. So if some people are using this book and other people are using the other book, at least we can track. So this is where I was to begin with. So what's typical in this prayer book is a little at the upper left or upper right of each page, there's kind of a little indicator of where we are. So we're at the candle blessing. We're moving toward the evening kiddush, the evening blessing over wine, welcome, and Sabbath songs. So there's often readings in English to introduce a prayer. And then a candle blessing. What happened to the candle blessing? Okay, I'm not sure what's going on, but here's the kiddush for the evening of the Sabbath. And yeah, I don't know what happened to the blessing. It's a little hard to work with Kindle. And then more readings. And so what I want to do is jump to, just try and do this quickly. So now here are a bunch of songs in the prayer book. Some of you may know the song, Hine Matovu Manayim. So typically it will be in the Hebrew, it will be in transliteration and in translation. I'm just going to jump through the pages. There's lots of songs for the Sabbath. Some of them are traditionally said at home. Some of them are traditionally said in the synagogue. And then we have a bunch of psalms traditionally that welcome the Sabbath. I'm going to go fairly quickly through these. There's actually 7 readings like this, 6 readings altogether, one for each of the days before the Sabbath. And then we have this prayer, Lecha Dodi, which has lots of different stanzas. And in Reform, we tend not to read several of them. So we read the first one, we read the second one, Meeting the Sabbath Bride, and then the third one, look at the translation, Royal Shrine, City of Kings, rise up and leave your ravaged state. You have dwelt long enough in the valley of tears. God will shower mercy on you. This is describing a Jerusalem and an Israel that's in ruins. So the modern Reform movement just skipped over this one. Also, the Reform movement skips a lot of stuff because we're trying to keep the service shorter. So in this prayer book, at least all the verses are in there. So if you want to do all of them, you can. But you know, when you go to services, we'll read this one. This is very nice. Arise, awake, your light has come. Arise and wake. That sounds encouraging. And then we're back to shame and degradation and ancient ruins and scavengers and devourers. And then we jump to this one, enter in peace, O crown of your husband, enter in gladness. So that's Lecha Dodi. And another psalm and another psalm. And then there's a song, Shalom Aleichem, and a reading. So, and then there is a reader's Kaddish, which separates sections of the service. And okay, so now I just want to show you a little bit of structure. This is Shema Uvrotecha. It says Shema and its blessings. I actually said her blessings because the word Shema is a feminine word. And the ha on the end here is a feminine reference because there is no it in Hebrew. So for the Shema and her blessings, this is going to be the whole section. And I think I'll go to the next page where it'll be in English or at least transliterated. So here's the Barachu. So typically what we'll have on most pages of Mishkan Tafilah, it's an incredibly well put together prayer book. We will have the Hebrew and the transliteration. For a while, they were selling versions without the transliteration because some people were upset that we were assuming that people didn't know how to read Hebrew. And it turns out most people don't know how to read Hebrew. So I every now and again, I come across one without transliteration. And then a translation. And then, okay, so here's what I was talking about with Cheryl and also Marlene. So it says the Shema is one of the prayers you can recite in any language, but also for those who choose. So now we're getting some stage direction. And Marlene, it's exactly the way you put it. You can do this or you don't have to. The prayer leader at the word Barachu bends the knees and bows from the waist, and at Adonai stands straight. Barachu et Adonai hamvorach. Baruch Adonai is the communal response, whereupon the community repeats the choreography. Baruch Adonai hamvorach leolam va'ed. But for those who choose. Then this is the opposite side of the page. So what you're seeing here, this is not the same page. On one side of the page, you will have the Hebrew and the transliteration and a translation. And then typically in this prayer book, you will have the other side of the open book, which for one thing has at least transliteration. So we know we're in the section of service called the Barachu. We're heading toward, and you may not know these prayers by their name, Ma'ariv Aravim, Ahavat Olam, the Shema, the Ve'ahavta, and so on. But the other thing about this prayer book is it will have English poetry, inspirational writings that reflect the same theme as the prayer. So in a traditional worship service, the exact same prayers are used every, let's say it's Friday night in a traditional service, the exact same prayers in Hebrew are going to be every Friday night. In the Reform movement, there has been a tendency to try and vary things to make it more interesting. So as a prayer leader, I could use the Hebrew as originally written, or I can use one of these English readings. And then after the Barachu, there is a prayer called Ma'ariv Aravim. There it is in Hebrew. There it is in transliteration. There is the translation. And on the opposite side of the page, there's an English writing, which is not a literal translation, but kind of speaking the same ideas. And the interesting thing, well, it's interesting to me anyway, here's the prayer. It begins with Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. And it's a full blessing because it has that, then it talks about some stuff. And then at the end, we have the words again. I'll go to the transliteration. Baruch atah Adonai. So we have another Baruch atah Adonai. And then it says, Hama'ariv Aravim. This is called the seal of the prayer, the Hatimah, and it summarizes the prayer. So if you glance at this particular prayer, it talks about God speaking the evening into being, altering time, changing seasons, stars, rolling darkness, light away from darkness and darkness from light, transforming day into night, and so on. And then the final blessing is, blessed are you, Adonai, who brings on the evening. So then on the other side of the page where we have, an inspirational writing, praise to you from whom evening flows, your wisdom, it's not literal at all, but we'll have the same Hatimah in Hebrew. And then here's one that's even less literal. This is an hour of change. So, it's speaking about the idea of changing, but not necessarily day into night, a border of light. So that's very typical of this prayer book. And it's, I really love it. Then you have another prayer about God's love for us, and, more English. And then you have the Shema. And that's the way it looks actually in a Torah scroll. So there it is in, simple Hebrew and the translation. And also this prayer book will tell us where it's from. This is Deuteronomy 6:4. And then on the next page, we have the response. And that's actually from the Mishnah, inspired by a part of the Bible of Nehemiah or Nehemiah. So again, the rabbis are doing a cut and paste from Mishnah, from Talmud, from Bible. They're structuring the prayer service. And then we go back to the Torah. This is the V'ahavta, and it's Deuteronomy. And then we have Leman Tizkeru Vasitem et Kol Mitzvotai. That's from the book of Numbers. So they're cutting and pasting. And then there's, we had the literal translation, and then a broader translation. And then they will have, interesting comments at the bottom of the page. It's a wonderful prayer book. I love the prayer book. And I just want to move forward a bit to get to another section. So I want to talk about the Tafilah, which is also called the Amidah. There's an opening kind of kavanah. Adonai, open my lips that my mouth may declare your praise. So we're going to pray, and now we're going to pray that we can pray okay. And that, if you're interested as to where that comes from, I'm going too quickly here. They even have that. That's like from a psalm. And then some inspirational words. Pray as if everything depended on God. Act as if everything depended on you. I love that. I think it's
Gevurot.
We're getting there. So we haven't gotten to the avot yet. We just had the very opening. So the first section of the Amidah on Shabbat is the Avot V'imahot. So this is a prayer about our ancestors, God of our fathers and mothers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Since we're going to treat men and women equally, we'll include Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. And then we will say, so that's the Avot. The next section is, again, more interesting English, is the Gevurot. Ata gibor le'olam Adonai. You are gibor, you are powerful. Let me just jump down to the Hatimah. Baruch atah Adonai mechayeh hakol. Blessed are you, Adonai, who gives life to everything. And if you want to go back, mechayeh hametim, that's in there too. So in the English translation, who gives life to all, or who revives the dead. So what's going on in the Reform Rabbinate, this prayer book is maybe 10 years old, is, there are movements within Reform rabbis, or, who don't want to give up so much on traditional thinking. So in this prayer book, they at least give you the option of going back to that. So here is more inspirational writings. So it's Kiddushat Hashem, the holiness of God's name. Yeah, we're still in the evening. And now we just have a bunch of different sections. There's Avodah, which is a prayer about prayer. There's Hoda'ah, a prayer of thanksgiving. There's Shalom. Let me just go to the one for Shalom. I just want to point out a few things. So in the evening, we sing a prayer, or we say a prayer about peace, Shalom Rav. As you'll see in a moment, in the Saturday morning service, that one will change. There'll still be a prayer about peace there, but it'll be a prayer called Shalom Rav, a different prayer about peace. So now I just want to illustrate something by going to page 108. So this is the Shema. Actually, I want to go further. Actually, I want to go to 124, sorry. So this now is the Sabbath morning version of the Tafilah. And some of the elements are going to be exactly the same. The opening, Sifatai Tiftach, they may have different English, inspirational readings. Same Avot, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Rebecca, and so on. The Gevurot is exactly the same as it is in the evening. And then you have a Kiddusha, which is much longer than the one in the evening. And this is the one with Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzavaot. And let's see if they say, for those who choose, at the word Zeh Karazeh, you bow to the left, and El Zeh, bow to the right. On each mention of Kadosh, you rise up on your toes. And then there are, these are other readings. And then by and large, the rest of this prayer is the same. Oh, they don't have the weekday version. I was going to show you weekday version, but the only thing I have here is the Shabbat version. So what should I show you next? I think, I think I'm gonna cut it off there. I mean, the way to learn about prayer is not to watch me on Zoom. It's to go to a prayer service. And by the way, not this Friday night, but the next 2 Friday nights, I will be leading services. So this is, I got to write this in a version. 'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the shul, the rabbi was teaching the halacha rule. All the Yidden were huddled in their pews in a glow, wondering what screwy rabbi would say or do. I don't know. I might work on that, but my tendency is not to work on that. With this small group, you will know, here's something I won't do. I may mention that I won't do it, but there is a classic song at the end called Adon Olam. You may know this song. So here's what I'm not going to do. at the end of services on Erev Christmas. Sing Adon Olam to a different tune, and that tune might be, Adon Olam Asher Malach B'terem Kol Yitzir Nivra Li'et Nasa B'chefso Kol Azai Melech Shemoni. It works perfectly. Adon Olam's, I have to ask somebody who's knowledgeable in music why Adon Olam works so well with practically every melody.
Rabbi, would you mind doing Adon Olam with We All Live in a Yellow Submarine if you do that?
Adon Olam. I'd have to practice it a little bit. We all live in a yellow submarine. Adon Olam Hashem Malach B'terem Kol Yitzir Nivra. But
I sing it a little bit differently, but okay.
You can do on July 4th. I do. Adon Olam Asher Malach B'terem Kol Yitzir Nivra Li'et Nasa Chefso Kol Azai Melech Shemo Nikra. And one that works perfectly. Any of you Air Force people? This works perfectly. Adon Olam Asher Malach B'terem Kol Yitzir Nivra Li'et Nasa B'chefso Kol Azai Melech Shemo Nikra. What I will do on Erev New Year's, on New Year's Eve, is Adon Olam Asher Malach B'terem Kol Yitzir Nivra Li'et. It works, not as well as Wild Blue Yonder, but you can do it on Olam. But I do have something outrageous on the night before Christmas, but I'm not going to give it away. You'll have to tune in, and it will be aired on. It'll be streamed. Temple of Dad Elohim streams its services. I'll send out a note, and if you want to sit in on my service, they actually do quite a good job of streaming. It's very professional. Okay, I realized I should have shut off my my recording before I started singing to Silent Life. Barbara, you just muted yourself. You were not muted. Now you are. Barbara Gerson. Click it again, Barbara. You're muted. There you go.
Okay.
Perfect.
So we are meeting next Wednesday.
I think we are meeting next Wednesday. Let me take a look at my calendar.
That's the 22nd.
The 22nd, yes. We are meeting the 22nd. Thank you for double checking. Let me stop sharing. Oh, now and I just lost my calendar. Okay, we are definitely not meeting the 29th. And we are not meeting the 5th. So, oh no, we are meeting the 5th. Take it back. So the only one we're skipping is the 29th. And again, I know many of you will be traveling, and thank God for YouTube, so you can catch up.
Very good.
And any other question? Actually, that was a good one to get on the recording. Any other questions or comments? Okay, gang. Next week, one of the most impossible things I ever tried was to teach all of Jewish history in one session. I mean, I couldn't do all of Jewish history in 18 sessions, but I'll just fly through it and hopefully whet your appetite for lots and lots of books written about Jewish history.